Hello, Taos County. I am Darian Fernandez, your Taos County Democratic Party Chair, and I am joined today by Mr. Brian Harris, who is running for a very important seat in the state of New Mexico, and that is Public Regulation Commission District 3. As part of our effort to keep Taos County voters informed and involved in the electoral process for this upcoming June 2nd primary, we are interviewing as many of the candidates as possible for as many of the positions as possible, and are posting this information on our website, on YouTube, and on our social media channels so that you can stay informed and involved. Mr. Harris, why don't you take a minute to introduce yourself to Taos County voters?
Hi, yes, my name is Brian Harris. I have lived in New Mexico for 21 years, the longest I've ever lived anywhere. I'm happy and proud to call Northern New Mexico my home. I have 29 years experience as a government attorney, including 13 years at the PRC. I've served as an economist, as a ratepayer advocate for the Attorney General, and most recently as an assistant to Commissioner Steve Fishman. I've been endorsed by Governor Michelle Lujan Grisham and numerous others. You can see my website. To get more detail about my background, you can also visit my website, brianharrisforprc.com. And I'm running because this is an opportunity to make a real difference with climate change. With the passage of the Energy Transition Act, New Mexico has become a leader in setting mandates for the utilities to transition to renewable energy. And I have the skills and the ability to make that transition smooth and quickly in New Mexico. And I think rather than just talking too much about my background, I'd like to just go straight to the questions.
Okay. So Mr. Harris, what does the Public Regulation Commission do, and why is that seat so important?
They have several different functions, but I say the main function is setting rates that are fair, just, and reasonable for the regulated monopolies in the state. These are the electric utilities and the telephone companies, both the rural and urban companies. We also participate heavily in the legislative process because there's always proposals to tweak some aspect of the Public Utilities Act or to change things around. So a commissioner serves as a quasi-judicial decision maker and a quasi-legislative representative. And so that involves mostly dealing with cases that are contested. A utility says we want to raise rates 15%, and generally 5 to 15 interveners come in and say no, and they have a formal adjudicated hearing with evidence and testimony, sworn testimony. A decision is written by a hearing examiner, and the commission has a chance to modify that if they can tie it back to the record. And that's where a lot of the authority and knowledge and legal background is so important for the commissioners.
Now, the PRC has been in the news a lot lately with lawsuits surrounding the Energy Transition Act. Where do you stand on all of that?
Well, I think that the law is pretty clear, and the Constitution says that the PRC shall regulate as determined by the legislature. So, you know, the people in the Roundhouse, they set the law, they set the broad policy. With the ETA, it was a mandate to go carbon-free by a date certain, 2045, and with various intermediate milestones. Some parties didn't like that. They felt that it stripped too much discretion from the PRC. The Supreme Court disagreed, and I think they made the right decision. And my advocacy, had I been a commissioner at the time, would have been that we need to leave the Energy Transition Act there, start implementing it, and stop wasting our time, because there's a lot of work to do.
Okay. And what changes do you hope to bring to the PRC?
I think I want to bring a real sense of collegiality, of mutual respect, of and a high level of competence. These are not simple issues that we're dealing with. A rate filing typically has 7,000 to 8,000 pages of testimony and data. You have to know your way around a spreadsheet. There's often contentious cases, and opinions can get very strong. Passions can run very high. I'm used to that kind of environment, having been a litigator for many years, and I understand the value and the importance of collegiality. At the end of the day, we're all trying to do the best for New Mexico, and there's no need to snipe or undermine or insult fellow commissioners. So I will bring a high level of collegiality and professional competence to the commission.
Okay. Now, you've professed support for a constitutional amendment that would change how the PRC is made up. Right now, it's an elected body, and the proposed constitutional amendment would make it a body appointed by the governor. Why do you support that position, sir?
Well, I know from experience now, this is my first election, the skill set you need to be elected is very different from the skill set you need to be an effective commissioner. I've managed to get so far in my election because I have a great campaign team, but none of these skills that I've learned are going to be applicable as a commissioner. A commissioner is, like I said before, a quasi-judicial decision maker. And I think we get better decision makers when they're chosen rather than elected. And, you know, one of the critiques about the amendment is it takes away people's voice. I don't believe that's true, because the Senate has a very important role in ratifying the governor's choice. And so there's two elected officials, you know, the Roundhouse, the Senate, and the executive, that are involved with choosing these commissioners. Their terms are staggered. They cannot be removed from office unless, you know, for very high cause. They can't be removed for political reasons. So I think it'll help us achieve the public interest a lot smoother and a lot quicker if these commissioners are appointed.
Now, it would also reduce the number of commissioners from 5 to 3, correct?
That's correct.
Does that have an advantage, a disadvantage?
Well, you know, a lot of the decisions that we make are impact the entire state. PNM operates across districts. A lot of the CenturyLink operates across districts. And it's, you know, a just and reasonable rate in Espanola is the same as a just and reasonable rate in Las Cruces. So the whole district approach to the PRC, I think, is another one of the structural reasons we're seeing the friction and the conflict that we've seen over the decades at the PRC. So statewide levels is good. An odd number to break ties is good. And 3 commissioners, as long as they have an adequate staff, I think would be perfectly fine and would remove a lot of friction.
Okay. Now, I think if this crisis has been very challenging for the state in a number of ways. And in particular, I think it's laid bare the paucity of infrastructure in much of the state. People have been asked to work from home, students have been asked to learn from home, and that on top of very challenging situations like in the Navajo Nation where there's a lack of running water to begin with. So what role does the PRC have in helping to build up the state's critical infrastructure like water, like internet, so that people can just be able to practice safe hygiene and make these accommodations?
Well, I think what we need is more investment in the state because we need money to build this infrastructure. Infrastructure is a basic component of what has made America great. You know, the Transcontinental Railroad, one of the first natural monopolies, by the way, and later on the telephone network and the electric network. People, to invest in that, need a high level of regulatory certainty. They need to be confident that they will get a fair hearing at the PRC. when they come to us with a proposal, and they need to think that the decision will be rendered in a timely manner and will be based on the merits, and that it won't be changed at the last minute, which is happened a lot at the PRC. And so one thing the PRC should be doing is creating an atmosphere where people who build this infrastructure feel confident that they can get taken care of in a business-like way. I also think the PRC needs to start incenting more creative thinking about how we can build these networks to serve the entire state. You mentioned running water. That's a primary basic essential. Communications is another essential. Electricity, basic fundamental building block of all future economic activity. So the PRC should be talking to experts, convening workshops, getting people to cooperate. There may be instances where there can be additional or more sharing of telecommunications and electricity infrastructure. I mean, there's a fair bit that goes on right now, but we could get more in this state, reduce costs for building this infrastructure, and create a condition where people want to invest in New Mexico.
Okay. Now, the PRC is a quasi-judicial body, and I'm not going to ask you what your position is on some specific cases that might come up, but for the voters, what cases can they expect in the next couple of years that will have a very huge impact on life for New Mexicans?
Right, that's an excellent question. We're going to see rate cases. The demand patterns for electricity have shifted dramatically. So the projections that went into the current rate setting process may or may not hold up. And that's going to be a difficult process to look at. I think we're also going to see a lot of cases involving what's called the Fuel Purchase Adjustment Clause. This is an expense that utilities have. They need to buy fuel to generate the electricity. And of course, the price of that fluctuates dramatically. We're seeing some of the lowest prices we've seen right now. It's historic and it's frightening. So we're going to be seeing cases that are addressing that chaos and disruption in the fuel cost in the fuel market. Finally, well, not finally, but the PRC, I mean, the Roundhouse also passed a Grid Modernization Act. At the same time, they passed the ETA. And so utilities are going to want to upgrade their facilities to allow for a more two-way flow of electricity as we get more genuine distributed generation resources. And we're going to see some litigation over how much that should cost, how extensive it needs to be, who gets service first. And finally, I think we're going to see a lot of action around the Universal Service Fund and how the telephone companies that operate in New Mexico can fill in the gaps of broadband coverage. As you mentioned, more and more people are relying on broadband for basic things like education or conducting a business out of their home. So I think those are four areas where we're going to be seeing a lot of action at the PRC over the next years. And then finally, a lot of proposals for new generation resources. About a month ago, the PRC turned down a proposal for two such sources for reasons that are unclear, but we're going to be seeing a lot more of those. And that's often a contentious process. So I hope that answered your question.
This is your first run for elected office, correct?
Yes.
All right. Do you feel like that helps you or impairs you?
You know, I have no idea. All I'm doing is staying focused on reaching out to voters in whatever way I can. The day after I turned in the signatures, I started this campaign late, so I didn't know what to expect. I really hustled to get the signatures. The day after I turned them in, I self-quarantined. I was nervous about having been exposed to so many people that I figured it was the safest thing to do. And so I have nothing to compare this with. I was hoping to be shaking hands. I was hoping to be holding babies and going to events and telling people about how important this role is and what renewable energy can do for New Mexico. I'm doing that one at a time now, just voter by voter. And, you know, if I ever run again, which I doubt it, we can revisit this topic and I'll have something to compare on. But right now, all I know is what I'm doing. And that's spending a lot of time on the phone and on Zoom.
Yeah, it's definitely been a challenging campaign season, even for the most seasoned politicos in the state and in the country. How else have you had to adapt your campaign?
Well, you know, my opponent obtained public financing. I went the private route. And as a result, as the money has dried up, he has about twice as much money as I do in the bank. I don't know the exact details. And, you know, just because I'm privately financing, there's a $500 limit on what any individual can give, A, and B, no regulated entity can make campaign contributions to my campaign. And there's a critique that accepting private money somehow makes you beholden to other people. Well, that's, you know, that's not true. We're doing this campaign on a shoestring, on a very small budget. There's been some great volunteer help, but basically just working really hard and hitting the phones.
Okay. So PRC commissioner is one of two positions in the state of New Mexico that can accept public financing dollars, right? What was your choice in not seeking public financing?
Well, the decision to run for office is a big decision, and I agonized over it for maybe a little too long. And when I finally decided to just go for it, I had 3 weeks to raise, to collect the signatures I needed. And so to try to do it and get the $5 contributions I needed for public financing, to try to do those two things at once, I decided it would be too much. Of course, I didn't know back then that we'd all be quarantined and economic activity would be cut in half. But, you know, I just didn't have time. I got into this race late when I realized no other qualified person was running. And I've been trying to play scramble ever since.
Why do you feel like you're the most qualified candidate for this campaign, for this race?
I have, I've been working with these networks in various capacities for almost 30 years. At the Department of Commerce, I helped some teams with with the Telecommunications Act of 1996. That was a long multi-year project. And that's when I started to learn about the telephone network. I've worked with computer networks, managing some research projects for the Department of Defense and using computers in the classroom, something that we're going to be relying on more and more in future years. My time at the PRC was sleeves rolled up, down in the trenches. I wrote testimony. Later on, I joined the I joined the Attorney General and I litigated cases, hired the experts, put on a case, figured out what the ratepayer interest was, and aggressively, zealously pursued that. And you know, that kind of experience doesn't come easily. It does take years to build up. And so it's because of my hands-on experience and my knowledge of both electricity and telecom networks, and that I feel I'm the most qualified.
Okay. Now, PRC is its own entity, but it sounds like there's a lot of interaction between the Attorney General's office, the legislature, and the executive branch. And also the courts. Can you tell us a little bit about some of the relationships that you've had that you've built up that would help you in this position?
Right. What was the last part of the question? Some of the relationships?
Yeah, with the different entities.
Well, I mean, like I say, I've been endorsed by Governor Michelle Lujan Grisham. That's because of the work I did with Commissioner Steve Fishman when I was advising him. So I met a lot of the advocacy community, conservation voters of New Mexico, who, because of that work and because they saw how I approach this work, they've endorsed me. Same with the New Mexico Building and Trades Association. They saw the work I did at the Roundhouse. And you know, it's not just the ETA. When I was an assistant AG, I appeared in the Roundhouse regularly, testifying for or against new proposed legislation based on whether it hurt the ratepayer or not. I've worked with Senators Candelaria and Stewart, Mimi Stewart, for years, more than a decade. I've appeared before her committee. I've worked with Commissioners Hall and Fishman, and I'm happy to work with anyone. Those two commissioners, by the way, based on what they saw from my year at the PRC as an advisor, based on my ability to be collegial when tensions are running high, they're supporting me. If you go to my website, you can find a lot of people that have worked with me and are very enthusiastic about the thought of doing so again. So I think I've got a pretty good network of professional colleagues who I can call up and discuss the issues coming up. And one thing I know is if they need to call me, they won't have a pit in their stomach worrying that the call is going to turn hostile, because that's just not, it's got no place in governance. And so, yeah, I think that answered your question.
Okay. So what's the best way for voters to reach out to you, learn more information about you?
Brian Harris for prc.com. You can find my my email address, my phone number. I'm happy to talk to anybody. And yeah, basically get on the web and look at my website. And my phone number is 505-819-7648. If you have any thoughts, concerns, or you want to ask questions about the PRC, that would be great. I want my term, I want my years in office to be a discussion. You know, everybody has a stake in these networks. They surround us, they supply us, they're so vital to our lives. Everybody has a stake in participating in how we regulate them.
Well, Mr. Harris, thank you very much for taking the time to sit with us for a few minutes today. As soon as we have this up on the web, we'll make sure that you have a link so you can share it out on your channels as well. Any final thoughts or comments for the voters?
Just that, you know, this campaign has been a fascinating process, listening and learning about what people are concerned with. I hope, I expect, I think I can win your trust and your vote. We have until May 28th to request absentee ballots. And I hope you can mark off Brian Edward Harris for the PRC. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Brian Harris, candidate for Public Regulation Commission, District 3.